"You're so lucky to have such thoughtful children," the hotel concierge said, as my son signed the paperwork with a flourish that should have been my first warning. David's smile was too bright, too practiced, as he pocketed the receipt for a room I'd supposedly chosen but had never seen. Within hours, I discovered just how thoughtful this trip to Italy really was. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. 3 months after Robert's funeral, I was still figuring out how to make coffee for one person instead of two. 42 years of marriage doesn't just end with a burial service, despite what my son David and his wife Lisa seemed to think. The grief counselor had said I was progressing well, whatever that meant. Apparently, not crying at the grocery store anymore qualified as progress. "Mom, you need to get away," David had said during one of his increasingly frequent visits to my house in Portland. "You've been cooped up here since Dad died. It's not healthy." Lisa nodded enthusiastically from my kitchen, where she'd been rifling through my refrigerator with the kind of familiarity that comes from believing you own the place. "We've been talking, and we think a change of scenery would do you wonders. Maybe Europe? Italy's beautiful this time of year." I should have been suspicious when Lisa suggested Italy. The woman who complained about the ethnic food section at our local grocery store suddenly had opinions about Mediterranean travel. But grief makes you vulnerable to kindness, even the artificial kind. "I don't know," I'd said, looking around the living room where Robert and I had shared our morning coffee for decades. "Traveling alone seems daunting." "Who said anything about alone?" David's grin had been the same one he'd worn as a child when he was about to ask for something expensive. "Lisa and I need a vacation, too. We could all go together. Make it a family trip." The word family still carried weight with me then. Funny how quickly that changes when you discover what people really mean by it. Now, standing in the marble lobby of the Hotel Bellman Villa San Michele in Florence, I watched David hand over my credit card to pay for what he called our family suite. The concierge looked at me with poorly concealed pity, the kind reserved for elderly women whose children handle their finances. "Signora Sullivan," the concierge said in careful English, "your son has arranged for you to have the most peaceful room. Very quiet, very private, perfect for resting." Something cold settled in my stomach. I'd specifically asked David about having a room with a view of the city. Instead, I was apparently getting isolation and silence. How thoughtful indeed. The peaceful room turned out to be in the hotel's oldest wing, down a hallway that seemed designed to muffle sound. My window faced an interior courtyard instead of the Tuscan hills I'd been promised. When I mentioned this to David at dinner, he waved off my concern with practiced charm. "Mom, you're always complaining about noise keeping you awake. This way you can rest properly." Since when did I complain about noise? I'd lived next to a busy street for 20 years without issue. But Lisa was nodding along like David had revealed some profound truth about my sleeping habits. "Besides," Lisa added, cutting her veal with surgical precision, "you'll want to be well rested for tomorrow. We have appointments." "What kind of appointments?" David and Lisa exchanged a look that lasted half a second too long. In my old life, the one where I trusted them completely, I might have missed it. But 3 months of living alone had sharpened my instincts in unexpected ways. "Just some paperwork," David said, his tone casual in that deliberate way that screams, "I'm hiding something." "Dad left some assets here in Italy, remember? His business dealings with that vineyard investment group? We need to sort out the tax implications." I didn't remember any vineyard investments. Robert had always been meticulous about sharing financial information with me. After 42 years of marriage, I knew every stock, bond, and savings account we owned. Yet here was David, speaking with authority about Italian assets I'd never heard of. "Wouldn't it be easier to handle this through our accountant back home?" I asked. "The Italian government requires in-person verification," Lisa said smoothly. "Something about anti-money laundering laws, very bureaucratic but necessary." For someone who'd never shown interest in international finance, Lisa was remarkably well-informed about Italian banking regulations, almost suspiciously so. That night, I lay in my peaceful room, listening to the silence and feeling anything but peaceful. Through the thin walls, I could hear David and Lisa talking in low voices in their adjacent room. I pressed my ear to the wall, a skill I'd perfected during David's teenage years when I wanted to monitor his phone calls. "Tomorrow morning at 9, Lisa's voice was barely audible. Has to sign everything herself. David's response was even quieter. Won't understand what she's... The rest was lost in the sound of running water. They'd turned on the shower, cutting off my inadvertent eavesdropping session. But I'd heard enough to confirm what my instincts had been whispering since we'd arrived. This trip wasn't about grief recovery or family bonding. This was about paperwork I wouldn't understand, signed by a woman they assumed was too grief-stricken to ask hard questions. I woke up to my phone buzzing with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief and chilling. Leave quietly. Don't trust them. For a moment I stared at the screen, wondering if I was still dreaming. Who would send such a message? And why now, in Florence, thousands of miles from home? Before I could process it fully, David knocked on my door. Mom, ready for breakfast? We need to get going soon for our appointment. I slipped the phone into my purse and opened the door. David was dressed in his best suit, the one he wore for important business meetings. For simple paperwork, he was certainly taking this seriously. At breakfast, Lisa kept checking her watch and fidgeting with her coffee cup. She was nervous about something, though she was trying hard not to show it. David, meanwhile, kept steering the conversation toward how confused I'd been since Robert's death. You haven't been yourself lately, Mom, he said, buttering his croissant with unnecessary attention. Forgetting appointments, mixing up dates. It's completely normal for someone your age, especially after a loss like Dad. I'd forgotten exactly one appointment since Robert died, and that was because the doctor's office had changed the time without calling me. But David was speaking as if I'd developed full-blown dementia. The grief counselor says it's common for widows to experience cognitive issues, Lisa added helpfully, especially with financial matters. It's actually dangerous for you to be making important decisions right now. How interesting that Lisa suddenly cared about my mental health. This was the same woman who'd barely spoken to me at Robert's funeral, too busy networking with his business colleagues to offer condolences to his widow. My phone buzzed again. Another text. Check your hotel room. They've been through your things. This time, I excused myself to use the restroom and read the message more carefully. The sender was still unknown, but something about the urgency made me want to investigate. I returned to the table, finished my coffee, and told David and Lisa I needed to get something from my room before we left. We'll come with you, David said immediately. I'm perfectly capable of walking to my own room, David. Of course you are, Mom. I just meant we could all head up together. Save time. But I was already walking toward the elevator, and something in my expression must have warned them against following. In my room, I looked around carefully. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed small details. My suitcase zipper was positioned differently than I remembered. My toiletries were arranged in a subtly different order, and my purse had been moved slightly on the nightstand. Someone had definitely searched my belongings. The question was why. My phone buzzed a third time. The appointment is a trap. They want you to sign away everything. Robert's friend Elena knows the truth. Trust no one else. Elena, Robert's business partner from his consulting days, the woman who'd sent the most beautiful flowers to his funeral. If Elena was warning me, I had to take it seriously. She'd known Robert longer than I had, understood his business dealings in ways I never fully grasped. I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just an hour earlier. I was going to follow a stranger's advice and disappear. Getting out of the hotel without David and Lisa noticing required the kind of strategic thinking I hadn't used since I'd planned surprise parties for Robert's birthdays. Fortunately, years of managing household logistics had given me skills I'd never thought to apply to espionage. I told them I was feeling unwell and needed to rest before the appointment. Lisa's immediate concern was almost touching. If I hadn't known, it was probably motivated by fear that their plans would be delayed. Should we postpone? David asked, though his tone suggested this would be highly inconvenient. No, I said, clutching my stomach dramatically. Just give me an hour. Maybe some fresh air will help. I might take a short walk in the gardens. The hotel's gardens provided perfect cover. I walked the perimeter once, establishing a pattern for anyone who might be watching, then slipped through a side gate that led to the street. Florence in September was bustling with tourists, making it easy to blend into the crowd. I found a cafe 3 blocks away and ordered coffee while I tried to make sense of the morning's revelations. My phone rang. Elena's name appeared on the screen. Margaret, thank God you got my messages. Elena? How did you get this number? And how did you know where I was? David called me last week, asking about Robert's Italian investments. When I told him Robert never had any Italian investments, he became very interested in what assets Robert did have. Too interested. I felt sick. What kind of questions was he asking? About your retirement accounts, the life insurance policies, the house. He wanted to know if Robert had put everything in joint accounts or if there were assets in your name only. When I told him most of Robert's estate went directly to you, he started asking about your mental state. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. My mental state? He said you'd been showing signs of dementia, becoming confused about finances. He wondered if I thought you were capable of managing such a large inheritance on your own. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. David hadn't brought me to Italy for closure or family bonding. He'd brought me here to sign documents that would transfer my inheritance to him, using my supposed mental incapacity as justification. Elena, what do you know about Italian law regarding financial guardianship? There was a pause. Enough to know that if you can be declared mentally incompetent in Italy and you sign the right documents, your son could gain control of your assets back in the United States. It's complicated, but not impossible with the right lawyers. I closed my eyes, feeling the full weight of betrayal settle over me. They've been planning this. I'm afraid so. The appointment this morning isn't about Robert's fictional investments. It's about having you declared incompetent and signing guardianship papers. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. What should I do? First, don't go back to that hotel. They'll be looking for you soon. Second, get to the American consulate. Third, call your lawyer back home immediately. As if on cue, my phone started buzzing with calls from David. I declined them all. The American consulate in Florence occupies a beautiful Renaissance building that normally would have captivated my attention. Today, it felt like a fortress, and I was seeking sanctuary. The consular officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Mills, listened to my story with the kind of professional calm that suggested she'd heard similar tales before. Unfortunately, this isn't uncommon, she said after I'd finished explaining. Adult children targeting elderly parents' assets, especially after the death of a spouse. The fact that they brought you to a foreign country suggests they knew they couldn't easily accomplish this in the United States. So what they're planning is legal? Not exactly. If you haven't actually been declared mentally incompetent by a court, and you're signing documents under false pretenses, that's fraud. The challenge is proving you were coerced or misled. She helped me contact my lawyer in Portland, a competent man named James who'd handled Robert's will and our estate planning. When I explained the situation, his reaction was immediate and angry. Margaret, under no circumstances should you sign anything. Stay exactly where you are. I'm contacting our Italian legal partners and flying out tonight. While I waited for James to work his magic from thousands of miles away, Patricia helped me understand what David and Lisa had likely planned. The documents they wanted me to sign would establish David as my financial guardian, giving him control over my bank accounts, investments, and property. Once that was accomplished in Italy, they could use the Italian court order to gain control of my assets in the United States. It's actually quite clever, Patricia admitted grimly. Italian courts are sometimes more willing to grant emergency guardianship orders, especially when family members present evidence of mental decline. And since you're a tourist here, you wouldn't have local support or legal representation. Evidence of mental decline? Patricia pulled out a folder. I made some calls. Your son and daughter-in-law have been building a case. They've spoken to your neighbors, your doctor, even your grocery store clerk, documenting instances of supposed confusion or forgetfulness. My stomach dropped. Mrs. Henderson next door. She mentioned that David had asked her about my behavior lately. They've been very thorough. The hotel staff was also briefed about your condition. You were placed in that isolated room so they could claim you were disoriented and needed supervision. The scope of their planning was breathtaking. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision motivated by grief or financial desperation. This was a calculated campaign to strip me of my independence and my inheritance. My phone rang again. David, as expected. Answer it, Patricia advised, but keep the conversation brief. Don't let them know where you are. Mom, where are you? We've been worried sick. David's voice was pitched perfectly between concern and irritation. If I hadn't known better, I might have felt guilty for causing such distress. I'm fine, David. I needed some time to think. Time to think about what? Mom, you're scaring us. This isn't like you to just disappear, isn't it? Or maybe you just don't know me as well as you thought. There was a pause. When David spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. Mom, I think the grief might be affecting your judgment. You're not thinking clearly. There it was, the setup for their narrative of mental incompetence. My thinking is perfectly clear, David. In fact, it's clearer than it's been in months. I hung up and turned off my phone. James arrived in Florence 18 hours later, looking like he'd slept in his clothes and survived on airplane coffee. He'd brought reinforcements, an Italian lawyer named Giuseppe Torretti who specialized in international family law. The good news, Giuseppe told me over lunch at a restaurant near the consulate, is that you haven't signed anything yet. The bad news is that your son has already filed preliminary paperwork with the court claiming you're mentally incompetent and in need of emergency guardianship. Can they do that without me present? In extreme circumstances. Yes, he's claiming you disappeared due to dementia-related confusion and that your mental state poses a danger to yourself and others. James shook his head angrily. It's absolutely false, but the burden will be on us to prove your competency now. There's more, Giuseppe continued. We've discovered that this isn't your son's first attempt at gaining access to your assets. He's been making inquiries about having you declared incompetent in Oregon for the past 2 months. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. 2 months? But Robert only died 3 months ago. I'm sorry, Margaret, James said gently. It appears he began planning this almost immediately after the funeral. The timeline made horrible sense. David's increased visits, his sudden concern about my confusion, Lisa's newfound interest in my well-being. They hadn't been helping me grieve. They'd been documenting evidence for their case. The appointment this morning, I said. What was it really for? Giuseppe pulled out documents from his briefcase. They had arranged for you to meet with a court-appointed psychiatrist who would have evaluated your mental state. Based on that evaluation, combined with the evidence they've collected, the court would have issued an emergency guardianship order. And if I had signed those papers, you would have essentially signed away your legal right to control your own finances. David would have become your guardian with full authority over your estate. James leaned forward. Margaret, there's something else. We've had your accounts audited. Someone has been making unauthorized inquiries about your financial status, bank records, investment accounts, even your life insurance policies. David, we believe so. He's also been in contact with real estate agents about the potential sale of your house. The restaurant suddenly felt too small, too crowded. My own son had been planning to sell my home, the place where I'd lived with Robert for over 20 years, where every room held memories of our life together. So what do we do now? I asked. Giuseppe smiled for the first time since we'd met. Now we go on the offensive. We're filing for a restraining order against your son and daughter-in-law, preventing them from taking any legal action regarding your affairs. We're also filing a criminal complaint for attempted fraud. Will that be enough? It's a start, James said. But Margaret, you need to understand that this is going to get ugly. David isn't going to simply apologize and walk away. When people plan something this elaborate, they don't give up easily. As if to prove his point, my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. Whatever lies people are telling you, remember that we're your family. We love you and only want what's best. Don't let strangers turn you against the people who care about you most. I showed the message to Giuseppe, who laughed bitterly. Classic manipulation. Now they're playing the victim. But I wasn't the same woman who'd arrived in Florence 3 days ago. Trusting and vulnerable. That woman had been buried along with her illusions about family loyalty. The woman sitting in this restaurant, surrounded by lawyers and plotting legal strategy, was someone different. Someone who'd learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones most willing to destroy you. The real battle was just beginning. David and Lisa appeared at the consulate like actors who'd rehearsed their roles perfectly. David wore his concerned son expression, while Lisa dabbed at tears that seemed suspiciously on demand. They'd brought backup, a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Webb, a geriatric psychiatrist. Mrs. Sullivan, Dr. Webb said in the kind of soothing voice usually reserved for small children and confused elderly people. Your family is very concerned about you. Running away from your hotel, refusing to answer your phone, These behaviors suggest you might be experiencing some confusion. I almost laughed. 3 days ago, I might have been intimidated by his credentials and patronizing tone. Today, I just felt tired of being underestimated. Dr. Webb, I'm curious about something, I said, settling back in my chair with the confidence of someone who'd spent 2 days learning exactly how this game was played. Who's paying for your services? Because I certainly didn't hire you. His professional smile flickered for just a moment. Your son contacted me out of concern for your welfare. Interesting. And when exactly did my son first contact you? Giuseppe leaned forward, clearly enjoying watching me dismantle their carefully constructed narrative. Dr. Webb glanced at David, who was suddenly very interested in studying his hands. I believe it was several weeks ago. Several weeks? I turned to David with mock surprise. But David, several weeks ago, you were still telling me how well I was handling Dad's death. Remember? You specifically complimented my strength and resilience. David's jaw tightened. Mom, you're confused about the timeline. Am I? Because I have a very clear memory of our conversation on August 15th. You said, and I quote, Mom, you're amazing. I don't know how you're staying so strong. That was exactly 3 weeks before we left for Italy. The room went silent. Patricia Mills, the consular officer, was taking notes with obvious satisfaction. Dr. Webb looked increasingly uncomfortable as the professional foundation of his evaluation crumbled. Mrs. Sullivan, he tried again. Sometimes family members don't immediately recognize the signs of cognitive decline. Dr. Webb, have you actually examined me? Run any cognitive tests? Reviewed my medical records? Or are you basing your professional opinion entirely on hearsay from people who financially benefit from declaring me incompetent? His face flushed. I was planning to conduct a proper evaluation today. How convenient. And if I'd signed those guardianship papers this morning, before your evaluation, would that have been legal? Giuseppe stood up smoothly. Dr. Webb, I think we're done here. Mrs. Sullivan has clearly demonstrated her mental competency. Any further harassment of my client will result in additional legal action. As they filed out, Lisa turned back with a final attempt at manipulation. Mom, please think about what you're doing. We're your family. We love you. Lisa, I said quietly, if this is what your love looks like, I'd hate to see your hatred. That evening, James revealed the full scope of what he'd discovered during his investigation. We sat in my hotel room, a different hotel, far from where David and Lisa were staying, while he spread documents across the bed like evidence in a crime drama. Margaret, this goes back much further than we initially thought, he said, adjusting his reading glasses. David began making inquiries about gaining power of attorney over your affairs 6 months ago. 6 months? I felt the blood drain from my face. But Robert was still alive 6 months ago. Exactly. David contacted an elder law firm in Seattle asking about the process for having a parent declared mentally incompetent. He specifically asked about situations where the parent might resist the process. Giuseppe pulled out his laptop, showing me emails David had sent to various legal firms. The subject lines alone made my stomach turn. Stubborn elderly parent refusing help, and mother showing early dementia signs, but won't admit it. The timeline suggests he was planning this before your husband even died, Giuseppe said gently, which raises some uncomfortable questions about his motivations. I thought back to those final months of Robert's illness. David had been unusually attentive, visiting more frequently, asking detailed questions about our financial arrangements. I'd been touched by his concern at the time, grateful that our son was taking such an active interest in his father's care. He was gathering information, I realized aloud. When he asked about Dad's pension, the insurance policies, even our anniversary plans, I thought he was being thoughtful, but he was calculating. James nodded grimly. There's more. We found correspondence between David and a private investigator. They've been monitoring your activities for months, documenting everything from your grocery shopping habits to your social interactions. A private investigator? The violation felt absolute, complete. My own son hired someone to spy on me? The investigator's reports paint a picture of an increasingly isolated woman showing signs of mental decline. Of course, the isolation was largely due to grief, and the supposed signs of decline were normal responses to losing your husband of 42 years. Giuseppe handed me a thick folder. But here's what's really interesting. The investigator was also instructed to research your financial assets in detail. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, life insurance policies. David wanted a complete picture of what he stood to gain. I flipped through the reports, seeing my life reduced to clinical observations and asset valuations. God, they even documented the time I forgot to put the garbage out on collection day. According to this, James said, pointing to a highlighted section, you demonstrated decreased capacity for routine household management. The fact that you missed one garbage pickup became evidence of cognitive decline. What about Lisa's involvement? She's been even more thorough than David. Lisa contacted your doctor's office multiple times, claiming to be concerned about your mental state. She also spoke with your pharmacist, asking about medications that might affect cognitive function. I take blood pressure medication and a daily vitamin, hardly the pharmaceutical cocktail of someone losing their mind. But she positioned herself as the concerned daughter-in-law just trying to help. Very believable, very sympathetic. Giuseppe's expression was grim. Margaret, they've been building this case for months with the kind of detailed planning usually reserved for major business acquisitions. The scope of their deception was staggering. While I'd been grieving my husband and trying to rebuild my life, they'd been systematically documenting evidence to steal that life away from me. What's our next move? I asked. James smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it wasn't a kind smile. It was predatory. Now we turn their own documentation against them, because while they were busy gathering evidence of your supposed incompetence, they created a detailed record of their conspiracy to commit fraud. The courtroom in Florence was smaller than I'd expected, but the drama was larger than life. David and Lisa sat with their Italian lawyer, a nervous-looking man who kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. Dr. Webb was conspicuously absent, having apparently decided his professional reputation was worth more than whatever David was paying him. Giuseppe had spent the morning preparing me for what he called legal theater. The goal wasn't just to prevent them from gaining guardianship over me, but to expose their fraud so completely that they'd face criminal charges. When the judge called my name, I stood with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 days remembering exactly who I was. The woman who'd raised a son, built a marriage, managed a household, and survived the death of her life partner was not someone who could be easily diminished by legal paperwork and false psychiatrists. Your Honor, Giuseppe began, Mrs. Sullivan is here today not because she suffers from mental incapacity, but because she's the victim of an elaborate fraud perpetrated by her own family members. He presented the evidence methodically. The private investigator reports that predated Robert's death. The multiple consultations with elder law firms, the deliberate isolation tactics used during our trip to Italy. Each revelation painted a picture of calculated predation rather than family concern. When David's lawyer tried to argue that his client's actions showed appropriate concern for an aging parent, Giuseppe was ready. Your Honor, if Mr. Sullivan was genuinely concerned about his mother's welfare, why did he bring her to a foreign country to sign legal documents? Why did he not involve her primary physician in any mental health evaluation? Why did he hire a private investigator instead of simply talking to her doctors? The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, looked increasingly skeptical as the evidence mounted. When she asked David to explain his actions, his answers became a masterclass in self-incrimination. My mother has been different since Dad died, he said, his voice taking on that practiced tone of concerned sincerity. She's been making impulsive decisions, forgetting important things. We were worried she might be taken advantage of by someone. Someone like who? The judge asked. Well, you know, scam artists, dishonest financial advisors, people who prey on vulnerable elderly women. I see. And your solution was to bring her to Italy to sign documents she didn't understand? David's face reddened. The documents were for her protection. Mr. Sullivan, I've reviewed these documents. They would have given you complete control over your mother's assets. How exactly does that protect her from being taken advantage of? The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa tried to salvage the situation by standing up and addressing the court directly, which was apparently not protocol in Italian legal proceedings. Your Honor, we love Margaret. Everything we've done has been out of concern for her safety and well-being. The judge's expression could have frozen wine. Mrs. Sullivan, please sit down. You are not authorized to address this court. But you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Please sit down, or be removed from my courtroom. Lisa sat down, but the damage was done. Her outburst had revealed the desperation underlying their carefully constructed facade. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 3 days' worth of revelations and 42 years of life experience. Your Honor, I've been married, raised a child, managed finances, traveled extensively, and cared for my husband through a long illness. 3 days ago, my son tried to convince a court that I was too mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. Today, I'm standing here having navigated a foreign legal system, hired international counsel, and exposed a complex fraud scheme. I'll let you decide which version of me seems more believable. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Not only were David and Lisa's petitions denied, but she was referring the case to Italian prosecutors for criminal fraud charges. Additionally, she was issuing a restraining order preventing them from taking any legal action regarding my affairs for the next 5 years. As we filed out of the courtroom, David grabbed my arm. Mom, you don't understand what you've done. You're going to regret this. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then met his eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in months. David, the only thing I regret is not seeing who you really were sooner. Back at my hotel, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. Giuseppe arrived that evening with news that changed everything I thought I knew about the past 3 months. Margaret, there's something else we discovered during our investigation. Something about your husband's death. The words hit me like a physical blow. What about Robert's death? Giuseppe sat down carefully, his expression grave. We found correspondence between David and his father's oncologist. David had been pressuring the doctor to discontinue certain treatments, claiming they were prolonging Robert's suffering unnecessarily. That's impossible. Robert was responding well to treatment. Dr. Peterson said he had months, maybe even a year left. According to these emails, David was arguing that the treatments were too expensive and weren't covered by insurance. He wanted the doctor to recommend hospice care instead. James opened his laptop, showing me email exchanges that made my blood run cold. In message after message, David questioned the value of continuing Robert's cancer treatments, arguing that the costs were draining the family's resources. The family's resources? I whispered. Robert's treatment was covered by his insurance. The out-of-pocket expenses were minimal. That's what makes this so disturbing, Giuseppe said gently. David wasn't concerned about medical costs. He was concerned about the potential costs to his inheritance. The room spun around me. You're saying my son wanted his father to die sooner? We're saying your son was actively working to reduce the time and money spent on his father's care. Yes. I thought back to those final weeks of Robert's life. The sudden shift to palliative care, the doctor's recommendation that we focus on comfort rather than aggressive treatment. I'd trusted Dr. Peterson's judgment, believing it was in Robert's best interest. Did David? Did he have any influence over Dad's final treatment decisions? James nodded reluctantly. As Robert's health deteriorated, David became more involved in medical decision-making. He attended several appointments without you, claiming he wanted to understand the situation better so he could support you. Those appointments I missed because I was too tired, too overwhelmed by grief to accompany Robert to every visit. According to Dr. Peterson's notes, David was very persuasive about the need to transition Robert to comfort care. He argued that continuing aggressive treatment was selfish, that it was preventing Robert from dying peacefully. I felt physically sick, and Dr. Peterson believed him. Doctors often rely on family input when making end-of-life decisions. David presented himself as a loving son who wanted what was best for his father. Giuseppe handed me another document. There's more. David also inquired about the process for expediting life insurance payouts. He wanted to know how quickly the benefits would be available after Robert's death. The betrayal was so complete, so unthinkable, that I couldn't process it. My son hadn't just planned to steal my inheritance. He'd potentially shortened his father's life to get access to it sooner. We can't prove that David's influence directly led to Robert's death, James said carefully. But we can prove that he was actively working to minimize his father's care while maximizing his own financial benefit. I sat in silence for several minutes. trying to reconcile the son I'd raised with the man these documents revealed. Finally, I looked up at my lawyers. What happens now? Now we make sure David and Lisa face the full consequences of their actions, Giuseppe said. Fraud, elder abuse, possibly even conspiracy charges depending on what else we uncover. And what about Dad? What about what they might have done to him? James's expression was grim. That's a matter for the authorities back home. But Margaret, you need to understand that this information changes everything. If we can prove David was willing to interfere with his father's medical care for financial gain, it demonstrates a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond simple greed. I thought about Robert's final days, how he'd seemed resigned to dying, almost eager for it to be over. I'd assumed it was acceptance, wisdom, the natural end of a life well lived. Now I wondered if it was something else entirely. The man I'd loved for 42 years might have died believing his own son was ready for him to go. The final confrontation happened not in a courtroom, but in the lobby of my hotel. David and Lisa were waiting when I returned from dinner with Giuseppe and James, their luggage beside them like they were refugees from their own scheme. "Mom, we need to talk," David said, his voice stripped of its usual charm. 3 days of legal defeats had left him looking older, smaller somehow. "I think we've said everything that needs saying, David." "No, we haven't." Lisa stepped forward, her designer clothes wrinkled, her perfectly styled hair showing dark roots. "You don't understand what you've done. You've destroyed our lives." I almost laughed at the audacity. "I've destroyed your lives?" "The house, the car payments, all our financial commitments were based on—" David's voice trailed off as he realized what he was about to admit. "Based on inheriting my money before I was actually dead?" I finished for him. "Yes, I can see how my continued existence would create problems for your budget." Giuseppe and James flanked me protectively, but I didn't need protection anymore. The woman who'd been terrified and confused 3 days ago had been replaced by someone harder, clearer, unafraid of the truth. "David, I want you to know that I've learned everything. About the private investigator, about the months of planning, about your conversations with Dad's doctor." His face went white. "Mom, whatever you think you know, I know that while I was sitting beside your father's hospital bed, holding his hand through chemotherapy, you were already calculating how much his death would be worth to you." Lisa made a sound like a wounded animal. "That's not fair. We loved Robert. You loved what Robert represented. Financial security, an inheritance, a way to fund your lifestyle without having to earn it yourselves. We're family," David said desperately. "Family takes care of each other." "You're right," I said quietly. "Family does take care of each other. But David, you stopped being my family the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead or incompetent than alive and independent." The words hung in the air between us. David's last attempt at manipulation, the final play of the concerned son, crumbled completely. "So what happens now?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now you go home and face the consequences of your choices. The FBI will be investigating the insurance fraud, the elder abuse charges, and the potential interference with Robert's medical care. Giuseppe has provided them with everything we've discovered." "FBI?" David's voice cracked. "Financial crimes against the elderly are federal offenses, David. You didn't just try to steal from me. You tried to steal from a senior citizen using fraud and coercion. That carries serious prison time." I turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and David? The house, the cars, the lifestyle you can't afford without my money? That's not my problem anymore. You're both adults. Figure it out." As I walked toward the elevator, I heard Lisa sobbing behind me. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old guilt, the maternal instinct to comfort and fix and make everything better. Then I remembered the months of planning, the private investigator, the way they'd systematically documented my grief to use against me. I remembered Robert's final weeks and David's eager questions about life insurance payouts. The elevator doors closed on that old version of myself forever. 6 months later, I sat on the terrace of my new apartment in Tuscany, reading an email from James. David had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for elder fraud and conspiracy. Lisa had received probation in exchange for testifying against her husband. Both were facing civil lawsuits that would likely consume whatever assets they had left. The view from my terrace stretched across rolling hills covered in olive groves and vineyards. I'd used part of Robert's life insurance money to buy this place, the rest to establish a foundation helping elderly victims of family financial abuse. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena, Robert's old business partner who'd become my closest friend in Italy. "Wine tasting at the Benedetti Vineyard this afternoon. You promised to come." I smiled, finishing my coffee. At 70 years old, I was finally living the life Robert and I had dreamed about. Not as a couple, sadly, but as the independent woman he'd always encouraged me to be. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger whose greed had consumed whatever love had once existed between us. But the life I'd built on the ashes of that betrayal was entirely my own, and that, I'd discovered, was more than enough. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.